presence.com. And today I have once again, the lovely Wendy Nash of kindlycutthecrap.com. Wendy, how's it going?
Good, good. Calling from Queensland, from Gubby Gubby country. And I think we were going to talk about Christmas and all sorts of scary things about navigating complicated stuff. And I thought it was very interesting. So Gubby Gubby, this is the sort of nation that I'm calling from. And the reason it's actually duplicated, so the country, the nation next door is Waka Waka. So it's no accident that it's repeated, because it actually means no in the original language. So it's no, no, as in, no, you may not cross this boundary unless I have welcomed you to my country. So it's a bit like, you knock on the door of someone's office and then you go, can I come in? Or you knock on the front door. You don't just barge your way in. And I thought, Christmas is kind of one of those times where people think you could just barge your way in, and alcohol, of course, fuels that whole thing. So I thought it was an interesting way of thinking about it this morning, just before coming on air.
Well, right on. And yes, and of course, it's wild to see that it is, summertime there, and we've got this. People are freaking out here because I think it's gonna be super super cold. They even deployed the National Guard or something. I heard in Missouri here, like 30 below Fahrenheit. They're calling for or whatever. But the one thing that I like to point out is that I kind of poke fun at it because it's just like fear, 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 fear of the natural environment. Really amped up. Now, I'm not saying, don't be prepared, don't take precautions, of course, right? But just know that the fear can be just as debilitating as weather and the psychological part of it. Also, I think I've mentioned this in the past. This is the map. Oh, it's really big here. Kind of a map of, and there's so much reflection, so it's hard to see. But what it is, it's the United States, and it shows where all the native peoples used to live before they were put on, off their regular land. And I met the artist of this, and it's an amazing piece, and it shows famous native people on there too. So I'm really happy to have that. But okay, so what I did is I put in the chat in Insight Timer Live, and T Lady Nat's here, by the way. Hey, T Lady Nat, we've got
Hey, dear
a
Nat,
T.
nice to see you again.
And
You'll be pleased to know that I have my cup of
yeah, we
tea.
both do. And of course, I might be talking about that when we get into the alcohol section. So I put in here, we plan to look at Christmas, family, tense conversations, New Year's, alcohol, partying, and how they relate to meditation and ethics. So, yes, Wendy set it up a little bit, and that's what we had written for today. So, where do we want to start with that, Wendy?
Ah, you know, gosh, where to start? So just first of a heads up, I've had a bit of an issue with my internet. So if I go invisible, if I start going still, then I do apologize in advance. I'll turn off my video at that point. I've just been having a lot of dropouts lately.
Ah,
Well, I was really struck by the pyramid of, I think it's an Abhidharma. So you've got um, the lower level, which is ethics or virtue, comprising wise whole speech. I really like the term whole speech. So you've got right speech, but that right, it suggests that there is a wrong. And I think there are some other translations where I've heard whole speech. And I like that because it's not only about what are we saying, but how are we hearing. It's really the whole concept of communicating and conversation. So I thought that was the ethical foundation of how do we connect with other people in our words. And so one is whole speech, one is whole actions, which I think is really about behavior, like what are we doing. And then the other one is whole livelihood, which is basically how we're spending our days. What are we doing with our time? Yeah, how wise are we, or how yeah, prudent and thoughtful are we in those three? So I thought that was a really good foundation to think, well, if you do those with kindness and care and prudence, restraint, and warmth, then really the next foundation of mind, which is, you would know this, effort, sort of whole effort, which is about, just bum on cushion, doing it regularly. And
Well, there's
you go.
that's a huge part of it. Yeah, I love these. And the whole, I actually haven't heard that before. I like using wise and skillful with these too, like a wise livelihood, wise action, skillful action, things like this. But the effort is really important too. And I just want to touch on that right away, because this is how I remember this: is we can let go of unwholesome states or whole states, right? We can then prevent them from arising again. We can conjure up or cultivate, create new whole, um, skillful, wise actions, and then we can maintain those as well. So it's like a four-pronged effort. And yes, this can be used on and off the cushion as well. Livelihood.
I think
Sure. Let's
you go.
pick. No, well, I think that's enough for now. We can address that. Yeah, the action
I think my favorite thing, and I think we touched on it last time after we
or effort.
ended
I'm
the
sorry,
call last
effort.
time. Yeah.
Mhm.
So was this thing about meditation hall. Somebody had at their front door before they walked out the door, meditation hall. And I think that's really a useful way to think about interactions, family interactions. Like if you want to find out how enlightened you are, go home to your family of origin and you'll find out, yep, you're just as crap as you always were. The other thing I thought was really interesting about that was it shows you the nature of context. We talk about interdependence and context, and how is the self not solid and fixed. So here we're having a lovely time, we're polite, we're thoughtful, we're kind, we're generous spirited. That's the sort of state of how we come together, because we're both Dharma practitioners, we both have been doing it a while, we've thought about it, go straight back to family, and we're suddenly 5 years old, and all that stuff just comes back, and it's like, yeah, you're not actually fixed and solid, because here you are in this grown-up body, but your reactions are just like whoosh, straight back there, as if somehow all these decades have never happened. And so that really clarifies how we are not solid or fixed or stable at all, how it's so dynamic. Anyway, you were going to say.
Yes, and at the same time, it seems, at least in my experience, I can catch it a lot quicker. Right? It still happens, but I see it a lot sooner. There's sometimes too when there's a little bit more gaps where, oh, well, I don't have to say this right now. I don't have to be on autopilot, right? I can like hold my tongue a little more, right? And so, a lot of times it doesn't make it easier. It still feels painful because I want to say something, but it's a lot of times, if I can catch that, it does help a little bit. But no, you're right. It's still there, right? It is still there. And so this brings me to the point of, well, I want to jump into examples too of things we can use here, right? Of what has happened and how we've reacted, and maybe how we've or responded, and how maybe we've wanted to do better, or maybe we've actually done something decent where it's helped us and other people. So. Um, I think I'll just throw it back to Wendy there, and this is so much to say, but yeah, that's enough for now for me.
So just a couple of things. One is I haven't got my because of my internet so low, I haven't got any of the chat functions open. So on any of the channels. So just Josh, you'll have to keep an
Sure,
eye out for that.
I'll check
So and
the input timer anyway. I don't know if
and we'd
it's on.
love and I'd love to hear people's questions. So if you have a question, um, really, this is a great opportunity to talk about it. So
It's
Yeah.
called meditation Q&A, by the way. So yes, always questions whenever. Yep.
Yeah. And I don't think we have answers, but we might have responses. I don't think any of us have got an answer. I've got the answer to everything. I promise you, I will cure all your ills. If only it were true. So I think what I learnt is that it's when it comes to conversations, like I used to, as you say, just blurt out. And I realized now that there are most issues in conversations happen with the first word of a question. Like it was that narrow. I got that narrow down. So it was for instance, if you've got you're sitting at the table, you've got your Uncle Dave, we'll call him. I just made that person up, but apparently Josh has got a real one. We haven't got the real name here, but he's got somebody quite opinionated. Then, coming forth about unpleasant, really, really opposing political ideas. Yeah. And so when I moved from Sydney up to here earlier on this year, our van broke down halfway along. We'd had our hire van, the axle broke, and so we were grounded in this town for 3 or 4 days. And it was the week of the federal election. So I just sort of asked in the beginning, who do you think will win? And because the polling's really bad. And I started this really interesting way of asking questions. So, there's a lot of contention at the moment with Trump and all the insurrection and all that sort of stuff. And if you sit on the other side of the fence from that and you're going, well, he's crazy, then it's about going towards that gingerly. But equally, I had conversations recently with somebody who was like, the government's really wrong, Biden's terrible. And you could equally have a Democrat voter be equally, Biden's really got the answer, and Obama or whoever it is, if it were Bernie Sanders or, you can really, it doesn't really matter who it is. So what I learned was some really interesting techniques in this process. The first one is get yourself out of the way. So just become super curious about the other person. So don't this isn't a statement about you. This is about becoming super curious about them. And I guess I trained as a psychotherapist and I work as a psychotherapist. I do work as a coach. I'm used to doing this, and it does take practice, but don't get caught is what I would say. And there's a couple of things that you could do, and I found this really helpful. Basic technique. So this is super basic technique. You've got your Uncle Dave at the table, and he says, and I don't know which side of the political fence you sit on, but I'm going to make it up. Donald Trump, the election was stolen from him. So that's the kind of standard line I hear. And so instead of rebutting with your opinion of what has happened, because then all you're going to do is spiral down into a vortex of horrible Christmas dinner. It's just not worth it. And you can't avoid it because you're sitting next to him, actually. So you can't avoid it. So the question is, so tell me more. Tell me more about your ideas about this. Tell me more about how that was stolen. And that just starts to fill out the space a little bit. And you can get a little bit more nuance about the perspective. And then from there, the next question, it's really, really good. And it's super good to hone the craft of listening. And that is to really pay attention to what does the person care about. They might say, Oh, it was, I don't know, the election was, because the election was rigged and it wasn't right and all this sort of stuff. And it's really going, right, so integrity is really important. I hear you care a lot about integrity and that correct procedure takes place and that things are done in an ethical manner. Now, I personally, I'm sort of a progressive left kind of person, and I just go, well, this, to me, it seems like Fox News is making it up and Trump is making it up, and that's what I think. And we'll find out at some stage, but that's my understanding. So I'm just coming clean and upfront. That's me. I'm not saying anything about Josh. So Josh, I don't know where you sit on the political spectrum.
Well, short answer, politics is an emotional con game. So none of the above usually. But no,
Okay.
if I can respond to this, it's really good advice and techniques, Wendy. I will say that some people, when they get alcohol, it doesn't really matter so much how, as long as we don't screw up totally, they're just going to go on with what they want anyway, right? So there's this classic saying that you don't talk politics and religion in polite company, right? But of course it always comes up. And this technique of getting ourselves out of the way, I think not only when it can be charged in general, but this can actually be something very beneficial, because if I want to connect with anyone, what does everybody love to do? They love to talk about what they're interested in, especially a lot of people like what they do. So I can connect really easily and fairly deeply with someone that, if, as long as they're not completely belligerent, it's by just paying attention, being interested, genuinely interested in what they're doing. And people, it would be surprised, even if we think we're not interested in something, a lot of people have a really depth of about the things they're interested in, right? Now, when it comes to politics, it's a little bit different, because may I venture to say that people are usually parroting opinions given to them, right? There's not a lot of original thought in politics. We've seen kind of the same tactics over and over, but it's good because it's a good test to do this, right? And I love this thing about, what do they actually care about here? And that brings out the best in people, right? If you, instead of them just saying, repeating an opinion or whatever, or being really emotionally involved in something, we can really tune in and listen, like Wendy said, and bring forth the goodness that is there, that they might not even recognize in themselves. So it is a beautiful thing. Yeah. So let's keep this in mind. And then what I wanted to mention here is this: we know that kind of people in our family or gatherings we're going to have, right? There seems to be ideas people have, let's just say about me, right? There's these projections that are there. Oh, Josh, he's like this. He's this kind of guy. He always does this, right? And this is how I know him. And this is, what I expect from him. And this really got to me way more when I didn't have a meditation practice. When I started meditating, I could actually see, yes, that's a lot. There's a lot of truth in that, in the way that the other person comes around, right? And so, but because I know this thing, I don't get upset about it as much anymore usually, right? I can just know this is kind of lingering in the background, but at the same time know that it's impossible for things to stay the same all the time, right? Because there are things that have changed. Certain events in my life have changed. Certain events in their lives have changed. They look visibly different than they did 20 years ago. I look visibly different. So that's helpful to run in the background, even if it's in repeat, and then I can be more patient. But this new technique I've heard about, and maybe I'm going to try this out when someone comes at me with this and just kind of is looking to trigger me to prove their idea about me and how I am. Like, maybe Josh is a-hole, or, okay, so I'm going to do everything I can to prove that. And then when it comes down the table, I can just say, instead of me fighting it, I can say, okay, yes, I'm an a-hole. You're right. So instead of me arguing or trying to prove otherwise, there's no more fuel left if I just jump in there and say, yeah, I agree with you. You're totally right. And
Yeah.
even, yeah, so I'm
Mhm.
interested to try that one out. Yep.
Yeah, so when I was doing my psychotherapy training, the psychotherapist teacher, she said, a client says, oh, you're so aggressive or self-righteous or whatever it is, um, opinionated. And you can say, yeah, yeah. And her thing was, well, there's something inside of you that is clearly giving that impression. Like there is something inside of you that is being met, that is being seen. Might only be 3%, but still there's 3% there. So to kind of just just be really clear, yeah, I can be an a-hole. Yeah, for sure. There are times in my life where, wow, I'm just gone, that wasn't one of my best moves, actually. Yeah, I regret that stuff. What about you? When are times are you? What have you want? Tell me about some times you regret.
Yeah, I wonder what that would be like. Yeah, that's yeah. So I'm looking forward to trying that. Yes. Okay. So now we've kind of covered like right speech, right action. Now we can touch on right livelihood, I feel, but the right speech, or I'm sorry, whole speech. This is the term Wendy uses, and I love that because now I have to be mindfully conscious, instead of just defaulting back into the groove of this same old translation of this, right? So, this whole speech. One thing I wanted to point out, though, too, that there's some people who actually kind of need to speak up, right? Like me, I'm probably a little bit more outspoken, so I need to kind of dial it back. More restraint can help me. Some people are kind of really shelled up, right? They would love to say something, but they fear all kinds of things. Maybe of not being accepted, of being out of place, um, all these different types of things. So I would definitely kind of look at our personality styles of, do I need to speak up more often, speak truth more often, or do I need to dial it back and be more with the, of course it's we speak truth, or we be honest, um, we speak kindly, we speak at the right time, right? It's got to be the right time to say something. Also, ideally, it creates concord instead of division. It brings people together instead of divides them, right? And it might be missing one, but yeah, those are kind of the ideal guidelines for speech, I would say. Yep.
Honest. Did you say honest?
Well, yeah, truth, speaking truthfully, that's the most important to me as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. Some people feel extremely self-conscious about my previous partner. He was very, one time we were walking along and it was like I had entered his way of seeing the world. And all of a sudden I felt completely, all eyes were on me. It was a very interesting experience. So we weren't in a conversation or anything. We were just walking along in the street. And I thought, this is what it's like for him. Oh my goodness, this must be so intimidating and so intense. And it would be so hard to feel that you had the space, that you felt safe to come forward, because it was just so intensely watched. It was awful. I just felt, wow, he's a very, very shy man, and he still is shy. Um, but yeah, I think that if you're sitting next to someone who is timid and self-conscious in the way they speak, then as somebody who tends to speak a lot, become really curious about them. You know, what's what's been happening lately, and just again really focus on what do they care about, and open out that conversation that way. And questions not to ask are ones that start with do or is or would you say. So they're ones to not ask, or why, so skip those ones, but instead to ask with ones with where, how, what. And it's hard because we get caught in habits of questions, but it's that first word which counts.
That's so amazing. We talked about that on previous shows too. Yeah, the what is really good. The where, and you said how as
Hmm.
well. Yeah, yeah. So can I ask how you discovered this with your past partner? Like it's a
Sometimes,
revelation. Mhm.
yeah. So sometimes I get that thing where I think the more I meditate, the clearer I am, and that includes not being in my world, but being more, I don't know, psychically connected to another person. And I don't mean psychic as in I'm, woo woo, but psychic as in um, just somehow I don't exist. I see the other world, the other person within their own world. I just find that sometimes more and more.
It is, and it's wild how much information is being conveyed non-verbally through micro expressions on the face, through body language, through extended silences, gestures, and just kind of feelings, right? Feeling someone. We notice that sometimes words are usually involved, but if there's really intense emotion, they can linger on, even after words are not spoken or even beforehand. So, yeah, I definitely know what you mean with that as far as some respects. One other thing I've noticed maybe about folks that are a little bit shy and self conscious is knowing, especially if they're introverted, knowing if I'm starting to drain them of energy, right? Because they usually recharge in silence and being alone. So it's knowing kind of when to pull back and not overdo it with folks that are more introverted as well. Yeah.
Speaking with a soft voice. So if you're sitting next to someone who's very shy, drop the pitch, speak more slowly, more measured, space out the words. So it's just very technical. Drop the pitch, so no, 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 and just keep it much more economical, I would say, and and more thoughtful. So don't rush to speak. Keep the questions, sort of ponder the questions as you go, and that creates space for the other person to feel like they're actually got space. You go, Josh.
That's beautiful. I was just going to flip the coin now and say, I think you've mentioned too, like you were in a family where you had to kind of, was this you? You had to kind of like put yourself forth, and I have to put myself forth and kind of not necessarily dominate, but jump in there if I really want to say something, to get a word in edgewise sometimes. So now this is the kind of the opposite dynamic, right? Where I might be jockeying a little bit too much for position to say certain things. And so that's a whole nother dynamic, right?
Yeah, and is it worth it?
Right.
Is the
Exactly.
conversation worth it? I
Sometimes you
don't.
step out of that and like, oh my gosh, what's the point of expending all this energy to do that? It's exhausting a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah. And often what I'll do is I'll go and sit somewhere where I'm kind of on my own, and sometimes somebody will come and join and sit next to me. Not always. I have been told off in my family for sitting on my own and not being part of the party. I invited somebody who didn't have family in Australia, and I asked if he wanted to come along to my family Christmas. This is 20 years ago. And then afterwards he said, "Don't ever ask anybody to come to your family Christmas. They are horrible people." I was like, "Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah,
It's
you
not
really
me."
feel, yeah.
So
Wow, how
so
about
he,
that?
yeah, yeah, he was very vocal. He was a very vocal kind of person. But it was interesting to kind of think, "Oh, okay, all right, it's not just me."
The hour has already gone by? This is amazing. I just looked up and it's like we just started. I guess we ought to start wrapping up then, huh? I guess let's. Huh?
No, we've
Oh,
already
I'm
hit
sorry. We started at
halfway.
7:30. Okay, great, good. This is one time that I feel great to be embarrassed about losing, not losing track of time. Good, thank you. Okay, so now what about drinking? Okay, so a lot of the strategies we have, right? They work very well. And but then when alcohol is involved, people, I mean, it goes without saying, a lot of times people don't act like they usually act, right? And it's kind of like this thing, well, they've been drinking, so they kind of get away with a lot of things, right? Or maybe they shouldn't, but I mean, like, how do you just deal with people that drink? See, so I haven't drank since 2013. I might have mentioned this before. It's not really that interesting. When I started meditating, it just, I'll spare you the background, but it just turned into one drink, and I was hungover for like 2 days. It was ridiculous. So I was like, what is the point? So I just stopped, you know. Now I will say, early on, I was invited to some like cocktail parties, holiday cocktail parties, and it was a little awkward with not having much time under my belt. And I was called out saying, "Well, why don't you have a drink in your hand, right?" You know. And then I've also been told before, this was early on too. What are you trying to make me look bad? Why aren't you drinking? But for now, I know that my friends and family, they know who I am, so they can't get away with saying, like, it doesn't phase me. If anybody were to say that, no big deal. But I will say, early on, it could help to have like a mocktail or cranberry juice or something until you kind of get used to not drinking. If you don't drink, I'm not saying there's necessarily anything wrong in and of itself of, having adult beverages. I'm not, because it's going to happen anyway. People are going to be around. But so that's just kind of the ground level for this. I want to get Wendy's take on this.
So I found that there are non-alcoholic wines, so de-alcoholized wines. So you could take that to a party or a thing if you don't want to drink. That's if you don't want to drink. So I don't have any qualms about people drinking. I drank for a good wee while after starting meditation, and sometimes I still drink. So the other day, and it's really important to do that sometimes. So the other day, I was at a friend's place, and I knew that her mother-in-law had just died, like the night before. It was a gathering, and so I just got some champagne and a glass, and I just said, like, I'm not an alcoholic, so for me to have a tiny bit of alcohol isn't a problem. And I just said, to your mother-in-law, to the son was there, and the husband, and so I said, oh, to your mother, and it was really a sweet. I bumped into him the other day, and he was so touched by that gesture. So not always bad to drink alcohol, not all contexts by any stretch. So if people do get itchy and scratchy about, because it triggers their sense of shame that they are drinking, and that's what gets the narkiness happening. I so yeah, I what I often do is I say, and you can't do this on Christmas Day, but you can, depending on if you're staying overnight at your family or whatever. But you might say, if you go to church on Boxing Day, I don't know what people do on Boxing Day, but if you can say, look, I've started my meditation retreat tomorrow, and I've got to leave early in the morning. So that's one thing to do. Often I will say, if it's a Saturday night or a Friday night, I say, I've got to do all my tax, or I've got some paperwork I really need to attend to in the morning, and I really need to think, or some strategic business planning or something. I'll just come up with something that gives it kind of permission, whatever. And sometimes what I'll often do now is I'll just go, I love the first sip. Can I have a sip of your glass of wine? I love the first sip. I'm not actually interested in the rest of it, but the first sip, can I have a glass of your wine? I would love that. I really like it. So that helps it to destigmatize the alcohol consumption. So I like that. And if you have a glass, like in my family, they're very weird, the fact that I don't drink, because my family members drink heavily. Australians drink a lot. We are very big wine drinkers, and our red wines are usually 14% alcohol, and the white wines are 13%. Like, they're really, really heavy drinking. So you can always cut them. So, half sparkling, half wine. You can do that with red as much as white. But what I think is is good to do is if you have a glass of wine, one glass or two glasses, simply notice how long it takes until you feel like how many days it takes before you stop being, oh, woe is me, my life is terrible, I'm a failure, or that grisly gray feeling. That just simply, this is meditation. Simply observe, notice. What are you going to say, Josh?
You mean after you've drank that? Because it's been so long since I have, but not, if I remember back. You mean so at like how many glasses does it take to trigger that type of response? Is that's what you're saying? Notice that the amount? Yeah.
Not only that, but
Mhm,
you might have one glass of wine
mhm.
and say, okay, well, that's my bit. And, you kind of drink lots of water next to it, or whatever.
Okay.
And then the next day, Boxing Day, on the 27th, 28th, it takes about 4 days for that alcohol to get out of your system. 4 days. Amazing. I was so shocked. That really surprised me. And as it happens, do you know the conversation? This is a website which is academics writing
Yes.
lay articles for the lay population, but in their area of expertise. And as it happens, there was one today, and it was drinking alcohol this Christmas and New Year. These medicines really don't mix. So depression medication, anxiety medication. There are a few ones, pain medication, some of the pain medications. Um, Also, what heart medications, schizophrenia medications, sleep medications, um, and yeah, so there are specific craft beers. I thought this is very interesting. Some medications shouldn't have with the most sort of
Uh-huh.
craft beer or homebrew ones. So it was just a very interesting thing. That is another one of the excuses you could say if you didn't want to drink, was to say, I'm on some antidepressants.
Well, Wendy, I'm gonna have to stop you right here, and I love the kind of strategies, but for me, I can't sit here and tell people to make stuff up. Right now, you
Okay.
can be, you can't there, you can push it really far. I mean, I'm saying you can push it really far. Like if Wendy says you want to do a strategic planning the next day, I mean that's totally legitimate. If, as long as you sit down and do that, at least for a few moments, right? You're not being dishonest about it, right? And yes, so. I would just, there's also grapefruit juice. I think there's some medications you're not supposed to drink grapefruit juice, which was I was like, what? Wow, what's in grapefruit juice? But this is the 4 days really struck me because back when I was working for a company, it was a company culture to just go out and drink all the time,
Mm.
and I would wake up and I would be like not hungover, so that can be really dangerous after drinking all night, right? Get up, no big deal. Like it didn't seem like it took that long because I would just maybe drink not too long thereafter, right? But then when I finally started waking up a little bit and realizing, and meditating, it did seem like it took at least 2 days to get it out of the system. Just one, it's pretty wild. Now, I guess what I'm talking about here is behavior from folks, right? It's great that some folks can drink one or two glasses of wine, a craft beer, and then that's it. That's all they kind of need. They can be social, but then you have the folks who they don't even really get started until the third or the fourth one, right?
Mm.
And actually, some folks can become quite jolly and outgoing and pleasant, and really lively and fun to be around. But that's
Mm.
can be more of a rarity. There's some people
Mm.
when they drink a lot, they like to, it's guys, right? They like to fight. Some
Mm.
people like kind of argue or make jokes
Mm.
about people, and not necessarily, and sometimes it's in good fun and it's okay. But then we get some people that are belligerent, right? So I'm talking about maybe the challenging problem cases as well. So I love
Mm.
Wendy's advice for actually being practical with those people who are responsible drinking, right? It's a lot of good advice to take in and how to deal with things when you want to kind of stay more on the balance when everybody else around is maybe pushing it a little bit further. So these are great tips and advice. Now, what happens when we get into folks that are let's say drawing attention to themselves through maybe a little bit of excessive amount of alcohol?
So just one thing I want to go back is like, oh yeah, I suppose it is kind of deceptive speech. So before I was talking about deceptive speech, I'm like, you could say you were on antidepressants or something like that.
A gray area. It's a
Um,
gray, or you could say, I've tried them before, and it's probably not a good idea. Or maybe, maybe someone has tried them in the past, or maybe you're thinking about going on them and you don't want to just screw things up. So there's a lot of things you can say that are more accurate instead of just a bold face. I'm not saying it's a bold
yeah,
face lie, but
that's
you
true.
know what I mean. So
Yeah,
yeah,
what I often say now is I just find I become a really horrible person the next day, and my life is too short to be horrible to people. So that's what I usually say
and a lot of
now.
people really respect that honesty. They're like, "Wow, that's refreshing to hear." I'm glad you really put it out there like that. I mean, they might not say that, but yeah, I'm kind of surprised at how people connect with just kind of really straightforward honesty sometimes. Because it's such
Yeah.
a rarity. It takes people off guard a little bit, but in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, there are families where it is complicated to be honest and straightforward. Like you have to, you know, lying is one of those funny things, it's you don't want to lie, no one wants to lie. And what is a lie and what's deception and what's omission and all the rest. It's a gray area, but I think at its core, the speech must be kind. So if what you say is going to trigger a bad reaction in someone, then then ca- caging your reply around that is perhaps prudent. And if later they say, but you lied, you can go, well, actually, I just thought your reaction was, I wasn't sure of your reaction. So you can be honest later like that.
It's a good
I don't,
Let me
yeah.
just respond really quickly. What I've a lot of times just being courageous enough to sometimes to say I don't know, or I don't really know how to respond to that right now. Maybe I can get back to you. This kind of
Mm,
thing, or I really want to say something here, but because I don't really know how to say it in the best way. So maybe I better not answer this right now. Just
mm,
kind of being
mm,
straightforward, honest about not really knowing how
mm,
to
mm,
say things or whatever. That's one technique, I guess, as well. And also, this pushes us too to become creative in ways of our honesty, because a lot of times it does take a lot of energy and effort to come up with something that's a little more honest, right? So a lot of
mm,
times it is easier just to say a little white lie. And no, I
mm,
do agree with Wendy, because what kind of harm are you creating? It's really
mm,
difficult for me to know if I tell a little white lie, if that's actually going to be better in the long term,
mm,
because I don't know a lot of times. So maybe
mm,
sometimes it will be. And sometimes I do get in a lot of trouble and cause harm from being honest in the wrong
mm,
ways. So yeah, it is a
mm,
very good consideration to,
mm,
to, to, to look into this deeply. And it's part of our practice too. Yep.
mm,
Especially
mm,
to ourselves.
mm.
Honesty and lies to ourselves is another huge area. But anyway, so please continue with the problem drinking thing I think we were on. So
If you've got a problem drinking, I mean, the five precepts, I was just sort of thinking about that. We're talking about ethics and meditation. And if you're problem drinking, well, basically, who do you want to be in 10 years' time? What are the impacts of of drinking without care? So, in this conversation so far, we've been talking about how to drink with care, how to speak with care. If you've got drinking problems, well, kind of look in the mirror, I think. And it is difficult. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about in this, that what alcohol does is it makes a person more self-centered and I guess more self-preserving. So lying about to yourself and others about your drinking is part of the side effect of alcohol. So I think that's really interesting that alcohol and increases your narcissism. I think that's I know somebody who did her PhD 20 years ago on this, 30 years ago. Um, yeah, and I, that's really struck me because when I think about people who are like, so we just bought this house, and the guy who had the house before was a carpenter, and he did his own works in the house, and he did so many bad, crappy jobs. And he did this really cute little children's cubby house, or Wendy house, I would call it. And it looked great for the photos for the sale of the house. But at the back, there were whole sections that weren't painted. There was no ridge cap on the top, so that all the water would come in, which meant that if a child was using it, they would get wet if it suddenly rained, and it often does up here. And it was also very elevated off the ground. So the ladder that he had created was an adult ladder. And so there were all these kind of, and it turned out all the stuff that he'd done in the past year, pretty much all of it, for the sale of the house to increase the value of the house. And he's done all sorts of crazy stuff. Like he built a concrete slab downstairs, and then it pools because it's not done well. And so he just drilled some holes so it just goes straight into the dirt, which means that you create problems with the foundations. Now, he was a very heavy drinker, and I think he probably neglected his wife and children's needs for that. And he's like, oh, he was a good guy, he was a good bloke, as you'd say in Australia. He's a good bloke, I have a couple of beers with him. That's where he did his office. He had like this really nice bar in the patio downstairs, and yeah, overlook have bonfire and all this sort of stuff. He's a good bloke. And he, like, I can tell you, he was cheating and lying in terms of the house and the presentation in order to maximize the return on the sale price. And I thought, I wonder what he's like with his wife and kids. So if you have if you're using alcohol to an uncomfortable level, ask if what harm is going on to the people around you. Because money, if you're married, the money that you are spending on alcohol, you could spend that on doing something lovely for your partner, your kids. That's not unharmful, spending money. So when I gave up drinking almost 20 years ago, I sort of went, oh, I wonder if I'm an alcoholic. And then I heard these like justifications come through my mind. I was like, that's a whole series of justifications. Either I am or I'm not, but I'll just stop drinking now and see what happens. It was really interesting. And it was just, and then I never really drank after that because I was like, yeah,
You
I
mean
was
to the point of
selfish.
intoxication, right? Yeah, yeah.
Look, I think it's really hard to drink alcohol and not have some level of intoxication.
Sure, it is, and that's why even kombucha, I drink it a few times a year because I'm so resensitized. I will get a little buzz from it, even though you can sell that without having to show a card because it's such trace amounts of alcohol. But because I've become resensitized, I will kind of feel it. Yeah. So this is a really important point in the five precepts or whatever. It's to refrain from intoxicants. It's not necessarily that they're bad in and of themselves. It's that the other precepts are more likely to be broken
Mm,
when one is intoxicated or
mm,
takes intoxicating
mm,
substances to the point of intoxication. And so, yeah, this is the thing, because I know in my own experience, if I remember back, well, the addiction thing is interesting because while it can also be amount, it can also be frequency, right? If I'm doing like one or two beers every day, for months and years, and then I can't just refrain from like 1 or 2 days from having that one or
mm,
two beers, well, then that can can be considered kind of an addiction as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be like large amounts, that can be another thing. If you have to binge drink, it could possibly be an issue then too. But what I noticed about myself too, yes, I felt more egotistical. Like my ego really boosted. I was like, they call it liquid courage, right? I felt more full of myself, more say are more easy in my skin, I guess. And inhibitions were just kind of thrown out the window, right? I was taking more chances, and they
Mm,
become more effortless than they normally would, right? And then the kind of regretted things later, or maybe not as much because I was drunk, and then
mm,
and then I would just drink more if it was too painful. So a lot of times, is it also being comes from a place of pain, like I'm in pain and I don't want to feel that pain, so I'm just
mm,
going to drink more until I don't feel pain. It's going to
mm,
numb out. And for me, I could actually feel my body more when I drank. Like I had more body awareness temporarily,
mm,
until that wore off. So yeah, those are just some of the dynamics that come into play. And ethics didn't really seem that important. It was
mm,
more about, okay, well, I would get mine, right? This kind of, oh, I deserve this. It doesn't really matter if I screw up a little bit. Everybody does that. These kind of justifications, like our behavior is, we justify things that we normally wouldn't if we have this kind of more firm foundation in ethics. And not to be a prude either, because these ethics are actually there for our long-term well-being and happiness. I am so much better off and such more pleasant to be around and just experience more happiness day to day just from those five precepts. But I
mm,
couldn't see them at the time, right? They just looked like two kind of prude thing.
mm,
Why bother that? When I heard about straight edge, this movement straight edge, when I was young, I was like, that's not a thing. Nobody can do that. Well, I didn't know about all the culture around it, but I just the no drinking or drugs. That's not possible. Hardly anybody can do that. No
mm,
way. That's
mm.
the mindset I was in. That was so impossible that can't even be done. I mean, of course, I was really young and naive, right, and wanted to justify my own behavior. But yeah, it is really an interesting situation with intoxicants.
Hey, I haven't seen any chat. Have we got anything on the chat? No,
No,
nobody's.
unless we have something in Twitter or YouTube. But the last comment was from T Lady Nat. We've got 32 meditators here. It says so. Thank you for joining. And I don't have YouTube dialed up, and it looks like there's 21 people listening on Wisdom app, and we've got what about 7 minutes or so left.
Yeah, about. I
Um,
think I've got
yeah,
about 5.
I,
Oh, yeah,
I
7.
will
Yep.
just say I will just say too, though, that I have the luxury of not doing a lot around the holidays, right? So my mom and other folks, they do a lot of the kind of cooking and preparation. So that's where it's a different dynamic too, because I don't have to do all that. So they're an extra level of stress. And I will say that I do excuse myself from time to time to meditate, or at least take brief moments of silences too. And it was real interesting during Thanksgiving, where my sacred space where I meditate in the room there, the new family dog had just crapped all over it, right? I mean, literally. And so if you're a pet owner, it's not that big a deal. But for me that doesn't have a pet, and this is my sacred space, right? That I sit right there, my meditation practice, one of the most important things. Dog doesn't care, just all over it. So, it's a really interesting to see how the mind reacts to that too.
So, what were some other things that I talked about? So, one was alcohol. We've done that. We've done speech. What were some other things that we were going to talk
We
about?
did well. We did right effort, right, or in livelihood. So livelihood, it's real interesting to find out what people do in their life, right? Like what they do for a living. And some of the obvious things are maybe you don't want to be, if you really into spirituality, maybe you don't want to sell drugs for a living. Say there might be a little bit more risk there, or you might not want to, slaughter animals this life. So those are the classic things that are given. But yeah, livelihood is it's really important. Looking back at some of the things I did for a living years ago and how they were conducive or not conducive to our long-term happiness and well-being and that of others. Yes,
Yeah, and it's
effort
really
too.
hard. It's really hard. So, say, I had a colleague and he went to work for a huge petroleum company, and the benefits he had were I get free this, free that, free this, free that, free this, free that. And it just boosted in. He's had a young family. You go, right. So this is not is so more nuanced than that. Or you could say big tobacco, or you work for one of the fast food companies in their marketing department, getting, or you work for one of those cereal companies like that make very sweet, sugary cereals, and trying to push more of that
Sodas
on
or
children.
casinos. Yes, yeah.
It's complicated, and we live in a materialistic world. I'm reading a really fantastic book at the moment by Johan Hari. Do you know this one? Stolen Focus. It's fantastic, and it just talks about how tech companies are stealing our focus at a collective level.
Yes, and they admit
And
this
so,
too, right? Yes, they admit this, and it's the economy of attention. Like they pay big money to get our eyeballs and our attention. Oh yeah.
right. So if you work for one of those big companies, it's a high status company. I'm going to say Google or Facebook, one of those, looks amazing on your CV. You're like, wow, I'm a brilliant coder. I'm on 100 gazillion million dollars a year. And I work for one of those big companies. And my job is to make people's lives awful. And it's got a status thing. Like, it's really interesting to kind of go, okay, so right livelihood.
It really
Okay,
is.
so it's big tech. It's no different to big oil,
Oh yeah.
no different to big pharma,
Sometimes
no
it's
different to
worse.
big food.
Yeah. Or less wholesome. Yeah, totally. And I wanted to kind of say this at the beginning, and yeah, these are really good points about right livelihood, right? Like how much of this is for the benefit of my long-term happiness and that of others, right? Like what kind of harm is being done here? What are my alternatives? Can I just leave this, right? So these are all good questions, but I wanted to throw this in here because I talked to some friends before the show about this. What if the whole thing we just called off the holidays, right? Which I have a couple friends, a couple and kids. They've done this. They've pretty much made it clear to their friends and family that we don't want to celebrate this traditional holiday here. We're going to do something different, right? And it's not because we don't like it, or I don't want to speak for them, but for the most part, it's been fairly supportive. And I'm not recommending this for everybody, but I wonder about if there all are alternatives to this whole thing and how to go about them. But I don't think we're going to have too much time to go into that. So, Wendy, would you want to wrap up with the right livelihood? Do you want to address this topic? And then what else would you like to say as we wrap this
So
up?
I do want to actually, this is a contemporary issue in Australia. So it's summertime for us. So we have our summer holidays with Christmas and New Year right up to the end of January, where we have Australia Day. That's our kind of Australia Day is at the 26th of January. So that's kind of our summer holidays. You have it in July, we have it this time of the year. And because of the bushfires and the weather, actually, they're starting to say we need to not have our main holidays for the year at Christmas time, which is what everybody has done for the last 230 years. We need to move it to March. So, as a nation, we need to move all our summer holidays to another time, because everybody goes to these camping places and holiday destinations in the summer holidays, but it causes complete, terrible situation with the weather, because as a couple of years ago, we had terrible fires. So it was just an interesting thing to think, changing it. Actually, who knows? In Australia, we might be doing that as a country.
How are people taking it? Usually, are they open and receptive to it? Or are people like, no, that'll never happen, or I don't want that to happen?
It's a slow conversation, but I thought it was an interesting one. The
Wow.
fires a couple of years ago were
Yeah.
traumatic,
Yeah, they were
you
huge.
know, huge. I mean, somebody said, are they bigger than the Californian fires? It's like Australia is the size of the whole of the mainland USA, and the whole country of Australia was on fire. It's like, is it bigger than California? Yeah, I think so.
People forget how
it's
big Australia is. Yes, yeah.
it's a huge country. So, but let's wrap it up there.
Sure, we'll do that, and we'll just have to wait to announce the next one. We won't do that here because I've got some big life changes coming up, which will be announced as they, I guess on the next one or whenever, if you don't know already. So, all right, Wendy. Well, thanks for joining, and yeah, looking forward to the next one. And may you all um, learn the things you need to learn and master the things you need to master around the holidays, if you're doing the holidays this year. So
And also, if you make a bloody mess of things and it's all a complete disaster, well, welcome to the human race. It's
exactly,
all just like, that's what it is. It's practice because you fuck up all the time and you've just got to keep practicing to try and get it right. So cut yourself some slack, is what I'm saying. The society
absolutely,
just makes it that.
yep. Whether you have 1 minute of meditation practice or 50 years, anything is still possible. Good, bad, otherwise, or whatever. Yep. All right. See you all later. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks.